Right, so now I'm going to move on to labeling the best fighters in every single weight division. I say every single. There's so many weight divisions. I'm not going to go through them all. But I want to give you the greatest fighter in each weight division. Now, when I say the best, I don't necessarily mean the one who was the best there, the one who you wouldn't beat, but I mean the one that achieved the greatest legacy in that division, stamped their authority the most, left a lasting legacy in that particular division. Now, I'm going to flow through as many as I can here. There's so many legendary fighters that have dominated their divisions and just stamped their authority. And I was already said, there's not going to be as many modern fighters because in the case of Floyd and Manny, they were so dominant. They are the best in particular divisions, but they didn't really stay at one division long enough to cement themselves. Now, they will be mentioned because they still achieved amazing things in certain divisions, but I'm looking more for who ruled that division, who stamped their authority, who could you say that is the greatest lightweight of all time, middleweight. So I'm going to flow through that, give you as much detail as I can. It's pretty well researched as this, but it's also taking my own personal opinion into account. I go off like the Ring magazine, I go off loads of journalists, loads of online stuff, and I try and listen to people that are credible sources because you will get a lot of the older guys that are really old school biased, and now social media is just, oh man, like if a fighter hasn't done anything before, you know, after 1990, it doesn't matter, they're old school, and people just discredit them, which is just, I try and keep my page as unbiased as possible to any of the times. So I'm going to fly through that. And I'm going to start off with minimum weight. I'm going to start all the way from the bottom to the top. So starting at minimum weight. Now, minimum weight isn't necessarily a division you may know very well, but I can guarantee you've heard of this fighter. It's Ricardo Lopez. Now, Ricardo Lopez was one of the greatest technicians in history. He's actually the world champion that retired undefeated with the most wins. He surpassed Marciano, he surpassed Calzaghe, and he surpassed Mayweather. Mayweather's 50-0. Ricardo Lopez never lost in 52 fights. He had a record of 51 wins, 0 losses, and 1 draw. A technically unbelievable fighter. A 2-division champion, but at minimum weight is where he stamps his authority the most. Over 20 wins in world title fights. He was a student of the legendary Nacho Beristain, who taught so many Mexican legends. Very similar style to the likes of Juan Manuel Marquez, but oh man, like Lopez was just beautiful. Like his balance, like that he had a really high guard and kind of bounced on his feet, similar to Marquez, but the way he delivered his shots, man, and they would land it with brutal efficiency. Just a perfect fighter. One of the more underrated fighters from Mexico because he was so small. He doesn't really get that worldwide recognition that the bigger guys get, but one of the greatest fighters of all time, a perfect technician. The greatest minimum weight of all time, Ricardo Lopez. And now one thing you will notice is lots of these divisions have different names. You've got like minimum weight, mini flyweight, straw weight. So if I get the weight, the name of the weight different to what you know, just go on Google and look it up because man, boxing has so many belts and so many divisions now, even I get lost. But I'm going to move on to flyweight. Now, when you look at the flyweights, in recent years, they've really exploded. You look at the likes of Roman Gonzalez, Estrada. The smaller guys are not necessarily just flyweight because you've got junior flyweight, you've got all different weights around it, but these guys are really getting that worldwide recognition now as pound-for-pound stars. But the greatest flyweight of all time is a really old-school fighter. Very old school, one of the earliest legends in the sport. And I'm going to go with Jimmy Wilde. Now, Jimmy Wilde was from Wales. You just have to look back at what the legendary journalists say about Jimmy Wilde. Now, doing all of the research I do for these videos, I've got Jimmy Wilde in my top 15 of all time. This guy went on an unbeaten streak of 93 fights. He was the first flyweight champion in history. He had, I believe off the top of my head, 99 career knockouts by the time he retired, and around 3 losses in 133 official fights. They reckon Jimmy Wilde had up to 700 fights, like kind of, you know, off the beaten grid, you know what I mean? He was just unbelievable. Like, and there's footage of Jimmy Wilde, and he was knocking out featherweights, bantamweights, flyweights. He was just knocking everyone out. They called him the ghost with the hammer in his hand. He's just a ridiculous fighter. Like, from the footage I watched, he was brilliant at getting in and out of range, incredibly tricky and incredibly powerful. The first flyweight champion of all time, an absolute beast, an absolute legend, the greatest Welsh fighter of all time, and maybe even, well, I think the greatest British fighter of all time, but because he's older, he won't necessarily get that recognition from all audiences. But in my opinion, the greatest flyweight of all time, I'm going to go with Jimmy Wilde. Now I'm going to move up to super flyweight. Now, I wouldn't normally cover these junior and super divisions unless there was a real standout. And for super flyweight, there is a standout. Now, you don't really see that many legendary Thai boxers. Now, I say you see loads of legendary Thai boxers, but actual professional boxers from Thailand, you don't get that many transition because Thai boxing is so big. However, there were two twins from Thailand that transitioned to pro boxing, and they were the first two twins in history to both become world champions. And that's Kalkor. And in this instance, the greatest super flyweight of all time, in my opinion, is Kaosai Galaxy. Man, all you need to know about Kaosai Galaxy is for someone as small as he was, he won the Fighter of the Year award over a prime Mike Tyson. They actually called him the mini Tyson. This guy was 50-1. He had that sole defeat in his career, early on in his career, with 44 knockouts. Man, this guy was just a rock solid. He used to blast people away. Probably one of the most devastating left hands in history. Ring Magazine have him in their top 30 hardest punchers of all time. For someone so small, that is an unbelievable statistic. And he just used to blast people away. He was just so strong. If you look at videos of him, there'll be videos over the edit here. You'll just see how solid he is. His left hand was so powerful and so formidable that it actually earned the nickname, the left hand that drills intestines. Like, mate, like, imagine having a nickname like that. That is just brutal. He made 20 defenses successfully of his super flyweight world title. Absolutely ruled the division. In his prime was getting global recognition over a prime Mike Tyson. So super flyweight is Kaosai Galaxy, the absolute beast Thai fighter. Right, now I'm going to move on to a few of the divisions that have always received a bit more recognition than those I've just covered. Those smaller ones haven't always received the global recognition of the divisions now as we move up. Now I'm going to go straight to Bantamweight. As I say, I'm not going to cover every single division, all of the juniors and supers. So I'm going to go straight to Bantamweight. Now, when you read through the history books, there are two Bantamweights that stand out as amongst the greatest. There are two that have that official, unofficial title as the greatest Bantamweight of all time. Now, my honourable mention is going to go with a Mexican fighter. He was the original Julio Cesar Chavez, the original Salvador Sanchez even. There have always been great Mexican fighters. You look all the way back to Baby Arizmendi in the 1930s. But this man was the first greatest Mexican fighter of all time. One that received national recognition. And it's Ruben Olivares. As a bantamweight, his division was absolutely stacked. In the mid to late 60s, early 70s, he beat guys like Takao Sakurai, off the top of my head, Lionel Rose, Jose Medel. Like, this is one of the most stacked bantamweight divisions of all time. Ruben Olivares was typically Mexican in the way he fought, front-footed, aggressive, one of the most formidable knockout punchers of all time in the smaller weight divisions. Even when he retired with 89 victories in his career, having fought in one of the most competitive eras in his career, he still had 79 knockouts. He went undefeated across his first 62 fights, scoring 58 knockouts in that time. As he ruled through the division, he suffered just one defeat, a defeat to Chucho Castillo, one in which he would avenge. And when he lost the bantamweight title for the last time, his record was 69-1. It's just unbelievable. He would inevitably move up and win titles in more weight divisions, fight the likes of the great Alexis Arguello, but he isn't even my pick as the greatest bantamweight of all time. For me, this fighter is so unbelievably underrated. You never ever hear about him. Yet all of the credible sources have him bordering around the top 20 of all time. He's a Brazilian fighter who lost to just one man in an 80-fight career. And it's Ada Joffrey, the greatest bantamweight of all time. Now, I say he lost to just one man. It's unbelievable because, similarly to Olivares, his division was stacked at the time. Joffrey would defeat the likes of Bernardo Caraballo, Jose Medel, similarly to Ruben Olivares, Johnny Caldwell. He was just an unbelievable fighter. And some of these undefeated streaks these guys had back in the day, well, like, you would never get that now. He went undefeated in his first 50 fights before he eventually lost to the legendary Japanese fighter, a man that I have at number 50 in my all-time list, fighting Harada. And fighting Harada was arguably the greatest Japanese fighter of all time. I think Naoya Inoue is going to overtake him. But it would be the only man to defeat Joffrey back-to-back. Joffrey would come back and defeat the likes of Jose Legra, Vicente Saldivar. Vicente Saldivar is probably the greatest Mexican southpaw of all time. And in the top 5-6 greatest Mexicans ever. Ada Joffrey was a beautiful fighter. He used to like swing this uppercut. His angles were like Lomachenko-esque. He was a brilliant counterpuncher, a formidable knockout artist with 50 knockouts in his career. Just an unbelievable fighter who dominated in almost unprecedented fashion in one of the most stacked bantamweight divisions of all time. He then came back after losing to Harada and never lost another fight. He had over 20 more fights, moved up a division, won the world title and ruled there. An all-time great and the greatest bantamweight of all time, in my opinion. Just watching the highlights you'll see on the screen, you can just see how classy Ada Joffrey was. And he is, without a doubt, the greatest Brazilian boxer of all time. But next, I'm going to move up to junior featherweight. Now, this one is a foregone conclusion. It's a Puerto Rican knockout machine. Now, we talk something that these guys have in common here is a lot of these guys are big punchers for small men. And this guy was maybe the biggest. It's Wilfredo Gomez, who in this division, barring his loss, moving up to featherweight to face the legendary featherweight Salvador Sanchez, had a record of 38 wins, 0 losses, 1 draw and 38 knockouts. He did suffer 1 defeat in that time at featherweight, but in this division here, he was a beast. He was absolutely unbelievable. He knocked out the likes of another formidable puncher in Carlos Zarate. Now, when Zarate, who had 63 knockouts and 66 career wins, another legendary puncher, fought Gomez, their record was something like a combined 52-0 with 51 knockouts, maybe even 72-0. No, it was 72-0 with 71 knockouts going into that fight, off the top of my head. Probably the biggest power punching fight in history. And Gomez would knock him out. Gomez was as explosive as you can get. He'd also move up, similarly to a lot of these greats, and win titles in other divisions, fight some of the greatest fighters of all time, and was just one of the most explosive fighters ever. In this division, every single fight he won by knockout. He retired with, I believe off the top of my head, 44 wins with 42 knockouts and just a couple of defeats to legendary fighters. So my greatest junior featherweight of all time is Wilfredo Gomez. And now we're moving up to some of the more recognisable divisions, featherweight. Now, I've already mentioned this man, and he's going to be my honourable mention. Had he not have passed at the age of 23, he may have not only been the greatest featherweight of all time, but maybe the greatest pound-for-pound boxer of all time. And it's the legendary Mexican Salvador Sanchez, who was just, like a whirlwind. He used to glide across the ring. An amazing counter-puncher, a brilliant defensive fighter, but one of the all-time great attacking fighters. Sanchez was effortless. He seemed to rise to the occasion the better his opponent were. He would just get more energy as a tough fight would go on. He defeated multiple Hall of Famers by the time he was 23, made 9 successful defences of the featherweight crown, had knocked out the likes of Wilfredo Gomez, the greatest junior featherweight of all time, Azuma Nelson in the 15th round, the greatest Ghanaian fighter of all time, Danny Lopez, a Hall of Famer, multiple other top world champions. Sanchez was just a joke. I genuinely think he passed away in a car crash at the age of 23, but I genuinely think had he have lived on another 5, 6, 7, 8 years, or he lived his whole life, whatever, had he have continued his career, we are looking at potentially the greatest fighter of all time. He had just 1 loss early in his career, close to 50 fights. He was in the 40 fights. Mate, he was unbelievable, and he was only getting better. He had defeated some of the greatest fighters from their country. In my opinion, the greatest Ghanaian and the greatest Puerto Rican by a knockout at 23. But it would take someone extremely special to overtake Salvador Sanchez at featherweight. And here we have, in my opinion, a top 6, 7 all-time great. You can make a case for the greatest defensive fighter, and maybe even the greatest boxer of all time. I'm going to go with Willie Pep for the greatest featherweight in history. Now, Willie Pep, I talk about Willie Pep almost in every video at the moment, it seems, just because he's unbelievable, and everyone says I look like him as well, which, I will take that. I wish I could box like him. But Willie Pep was 54-0 when he won the featherweight title. By the time he eventually lost it years later, for the second time, he had a record of 134-1 with one draw. That's the level of skill we're talking about with Pep. Now, if you've seen any of my other videos, you'll know what a defensive wizard he was, how crafty he was. But he went on undefeated streaks in this time of 62-0 and 72-0. Like, this is just unprecedented. During his second undefeated streak of 72-0, he was in a deadly plane crash that killed 60% of the people on board. He was in a full body cast and was told he'd never walk again, let alone box. And then he goes and has another 100 fights. Retired with a record of 229 wins to 11 losses. Like, it's unbelievable. Willie Pep would defeat the likes of the great Sandy Sadler. He would defeat multiple world champions, Hall of Famers. He lost his first fight to Sammy Angot, a legendary Hall of Famer. But he was most well known in this reign for his trilogy against Sandy Sadler, who was kind of built like the Thomas Hearns of his era, like incredibly tall, over 100 knockouts. And he would beat Pep more times than Pep would beat him in their rivalry. But the fact that he was able to overcome such a puncher, reclaim the title and still rule, Pep was just unbelievable. And he is, in my opinion, the greatest featherweight of all time. Moving up, we're going to go to junior lightweight. And this is... There are two fighters here that I think you could make a case as being the greatest junior lightweights of all time. Now, the first is Floyd Mayweather Jr. And this was the first division he won his world title in when he beat the legendary Gennaro Hernandez. And then he was just... This was Pretty Boy Floyd. You hear people talk about Floyd Mayweather, Money Mayweather, but Pretty Boy Floyd, oh my days, like, he was unbelievable. Like, powerful, strong, fast. Even watching his fight with Diego Corrales, you hear Larry Merchant comparing him to Willie Pep, like in skill. But he was Willie Pep with a little bit more pop. Well, maybe even a lot more pop. That Diego Corrales fight, which I think is prime Floyd, I think it's his greatest performance because Corrales was undefeated. Similarly to Sandy Sadler in a sense, I don't think he's anywhere near the level as a Sandy Sadler, but similarly freakishly tall and powerful for the division, and Floyd just put an absolute schooling on him. This was Floyd at his very, very best. He made 8 successful defences of this title, of the junior lightweight title, before obviously moving up to become a 5-division world champion and one of the greatest fighters of all time. But there's one man that I think trumps Floyd in this field, and it's the great explosive thin man, Nicaragua's Alexis Arguello, who similarly to Floyd had 8 successful title defences in this reign. But this was Arguello at his absolute best, a complete knockout freak, extremely skinny, extremely unassuming looking, but just unbelievably strong. There was those amazing fights against Alfredo Escalara, in which he won. He stopped the likes of Bobby Chacon, Rafael Lemon, Ruben Castillo. He was just a freak at this time. He was so strong, so dominant, and stamped himself as, in my opinion, the greatest junior lightweight of all time. I really do think this is the toughest of the two because they were just so good. I might even split this one, but if I was just going to put one ahead, I think with just how devastating he was in his peak and just how good the level of opposition were, I'm going to go with Alexis Arguello. But Floyd Mayweather Jr., Pretty Boy Floyd in this division was absolutely unbeatable. Moving up to lightweight. Now, this one is pretty easy for me, but it is also a stacked division historically. You go back to the very, very beginnings. Joe Gans, one of the first African-American world champions of all time. Not the first, that was George Dixon in the late 19th century. But Joe Gans was like a pioneer of the early 20th century. Like he was deemed unbeatable. I believe, off the top of my head, he went like 40 rounds winning fights, maybe against Battling Nelson. That I might have mistaken that for someone else, but it was the era anyway. I'm almost certain Joe Gans beat Battling Nelson in the 40th round. But he was seen as like unbelievably skillful, unbelievably unbeatable. Maybe a pioneer of all of these modern tricks that you see today. An unbelievable jab, just a ring technician who dominated for so long. For a long time, Joe Gans was the greatest lightweight of all time for a very long time. Just a true beast of the sport. And it actually goes to show how good Sam Langford was, who I talk about as one of my greatest of all time, because Sam Langford beat Joe Gans at 17 years old. I think you could also make a case for Pernell Whitaker in the talks of greatest lightweight. I think he was unbelievable. Like the skill level of that man, like just all-rounder, and just how pleasing he was to watch on the eye. But when we're talking about greatest lightweights, there's two that stand out to me. There is one that is just, you can't debate it, but One of the greatest ring technicians of all time was the ghetto wizard in the 1910s and the 1920s, Benny Leonard. Benny Leonard ruled the lightweight division for 7 years, an extremely competitive one. Around 7 years. I do all of this off the top of my head, so if my stats are off, do forgive me. But it was around 7 years. I think he lost about 19 times in his first 100 fights whilst he was learning the craft. But he would lose just twice in the next 100 plus fights when he was champion. And he was like the first modern fighter, an absolute genius. If you watch the way that he was moving 110 years ago, you could put him in the ring with anyone today and it would hold up. Fighters just didn't move like Benny Leonard back then. He was just a complete freak. His ring IQ, maybe the greatest ring IQ in history, the greatest technician. He had quite a lot of knockouts as well, but defensively, one of the greatest defensive fighters still, all these years later. But the greatest lightweight of all time is unarguably Roberto Duran. Now, Roberto Duran was just an absolute freak at lightweight. The hands of stone, the knockout machine, the most menacing fighter of all time. He beat the likes of Ken Buchanan, a Hall of Famer for the title, the great Esteban de Jesus. Now, to put it into context, what Duran would do at lightweight mimicked what Hagler would do at middleweight. It was just unbelievable. He lost just once to Esteban de Jesus and avenged that twice in perfect performances. He even beat the great Ernesto Marcel the year before he won the lightweight world title. So for the entire 1970s, he was seemingly unbeatable. He amassed his record up to 71-1 after moving up to welterweight before he would face Sugar Ray Leonard, defeating Leonard to become 72-1 with 56 knockouts off the top of my head. Duran at this weight was just fierce, defensively sound, as explosive as you get, but as cute as you get as well. Like he just controlled his opposition, and I've seen people write about Duran like you weren't just boxing a fighter, you were boxing the devil in the ring in his prime. And then he would move up and win world titles across 3 more weight divisions when the divisions were a lot wider apart than they are today. But as a lightweight, unsurpassable, basically conquered the sport. And to go up 12 pounds to beat a prime Sugar Ray Leonard just shows how good he must have been against the 135 pounders, because he was just crazy good. So the greatest lightweight of all time, Roberto Duran. Now going up to junior welterweight, I think you could give Aaron Pryor a shout out. Beat the great Antonio Cervantes, the amazing Alexis Arguello, who was trying to win his 4th title division. Pryor was just an unbelievable bundle of energy. A great fight, and didn't get the biggest fights that he deserved at the weight, in my opinion. I think you could also give a shout out to Kostya Tszyu, who ruled the division in the 2000s and the 90s. A brilliant technician, one of the great amateurs. His fight against Vernon Forrest in the amateurs is just, beautiful to watch. Tszyu he had one of the most aesthetically pleasing styles, but was also like a Gennady Golovkin type knockout machine. An amazing body puncher, but a straight hand from the gods. And dominated that division for a large part until he lost to Ricky Hatton in a massive upset in 2005. But for me, it's Julio Cesar Chavez, who was 18-1 across the division at that time. Scored some of his best victories as well. Beat Greg Horgan, Hector Camacho, the legendary Meldrick Taylor fight at that weight division. Obviously would lose to Frankie Randall at the division. During the time would move up to welterweight and have that controversial draw against Pernell Whitaker. But I believe this was Chavez at his very best here. He also defeated the likes of Roger Mayweather to win the light welterweight title. Chavez was just solid here. He was just walking people down and battering them. I think this is prime Chavez at junior welterweight, and he is, in my opinion, the greatest junior welterweight of all time. But we're going to move on to welterweight, where there have been many great fighters. You look at Sugar Ray Leonard, who beat the likes of Roberto Duran and Tommy Hearns, and Wilfred Benitez at welterweight. 3 names that you would definitely put in and around the top 50 of all time, maybe even higher. But there's just one, you can't surpass him at welterweight. It's the unbeatable Sugar Ray Robinson, who, although I say unbeatable, did suffer just 1 loss at this time in around 130 fights until he would lose at middleweight to Randolph Turpin. But at welterweight, he was just the greatest fighter of all time. This is where he really, really cements himself as the greatest of all time. He went on that 90-plus fight undefeated streak, lost his 40th fight to Jake LaMotta, and then beat him 4 more times after. Beat the great Kid Gavilan, one of the all-time great welterweights that doesn't quite get the recognition he deserved because he didn't he wasn't able to dominate Robinson. He won the title after Robinson moved up. But Robinson, Henry Armstrong, there's just so many top fighters. Sammy Angot, the man that beat Willie Pep. He went 92-0 and basically beat everyone. Or 91-0 off the top of my head. He won around 90 fights. Moved up and won the middleweight title as well. But as a welterweight, he was just seemed unbeatable. Now, the tragedy of this is there's no footage of him at welterweight, which is up there with the Harry Greb footage. You just need to see this. Like, you need to, like, the footage we see of Robinson is past his best, which is just unfathomable. Like, imagine he looks like the perfect fighter when he's past his peak. Imagine him in his peak when he's going on that unbeaten streak. For me, I just think this is the easiest one, to be honest. Welterweight, Sugar Ray Robinson. Now, junior welterweight is a tough one. There's two. I think you go with Mike McCallum, who was undefeated at the weight division, knocked out Julian Jackson, scored that stunning left hook knockout over Don Curry. Top fighters are Ayub Kaluli and, of course, Milton McCrory. But I'm going to go with Tommy Hearns, who just has those massive level names at light middleweight. That stunning knockout of Roberto Duran. Like, no one did that to Roberto Duran other than Tommy Hearns in 120 fights. He also defeated the great Wilfred Benitez at junior middleweight, amongst other victories. For me, I don't see any other junior middleweight, maybe barring Mike McCallum, ironically, beating Tommy Hearns. So for junior middleweight, I'm going to go with Tommy Hearns, although you could put him in the welterweight category as well, because he was a phenomenal welterweight. I'm going to move up to middleweight, one of the most disputable ones. Now, I think this is the one that might cause the most controversy, but I'm going on an all-time basis here. Sugar Ray Robinson is in with a shout. He wasn't at his most dominant here, though. It's worth noting that he was taking a lot of his losses here, albeit avenging them against some of the greatest fighters of all time. But this wasn't where he dominated. That was at welterweight. The fact that he was able to compete, win the middleweight title 5 times, and always bounce back cements his greatness further. But I wouldn't put him as the greatest middleweight of all time. Undeniably the greatest welterweight of all time, and within a shout of the greatest middleweight of all time. I think Gennady Golovkin is one of the most formidable middleweights of all time in recent years, but doesn't have the resume to put him near the top. Bernard Hopkins, you could put near the top as well, ruled the division for around a decade. But there are 3 that really stand out, and obviously one is Marvin Hagler, who ruled the division for 7 years, beat the likes of Roberto Duran, Tommy Hearns, Sugar Ray Robinson, but a lot of those guys were moving up. He also beat top fighters in John Mugabe, who was a fearsome punching junior middleweight who moved up, and amongst other fighters as well, Alan Minter, Vito Antuofermo. Ruled for 7 years, 12 successful defences with 11 knockouts. And then there's Carlos Monzon, who many would put over Hagler, who, similarly to Hagler, boxed a lot of greats that moved up like Emil Griffith and Jose Napoles, but brutally knocked out Nino Benvenuti, one of the all-time great middleweights, Rodrigo Valdez, an absolute beast. Fearsome man, inside and outside the ring, a bit of a nasty man, to be honest with you, but went unbeaten in his last 83 fights. Again, ruling as middleweight champion, similarly to Hagler, making all those title defences. But for middleweight, I'm actually going to go with Harry Greb. Now, after reading about Harry Greb's life and his rule as a middleweight champion, I just think there's no one that can compare to his resume as a middleweight. You had amazing fighters like Tommy Loughran, the legendary Tiger Flowers, one of the all-time great middleweights. Mickey Walker, who would win the middleweight title. Greb was fighting Hall of Famer after Hall of Famer. Lots of his fights were against light heavyweights and even heavyweights. He's the only man to defeat Gene Tunney. Greb was basically dominant over a span of 300 fights. Probably around 200 of those is where he really hit his peak and he wasn't losing a lot. The first 100, he was kind of getting used to it. Went on unbeaten streaks of 45-0 in 12 months. Lost once in around 120 fights in his peak. But Greb was just a freak. Dealt with so many injuries, had such a high work rate, but beat so many legendary middleweights. I think his resume surpasses everyone. He defeated 16 Hall of Famers, which is just, compare it to Benvenuti, compare it to Monzon and Hagler, it absolutely dwarfs their resume. And most of these guys were bigger than the middleweight division, whereas Monzon and Hagler, although their opposition were great, maybe even arguably greater than Greb's opposition, their greatest opponents were moving up. Greb, in my opinion, is the greatest middleweight champion of all time. Even during his run, he was so avoided And he beat multiple world champions at middleweight and light heavyweight. He actually beat them in world title fights. But back then, you could only win the title by a knockout. So even if you won every round, if you didn't stop the guy, you didn't win the world title. And he should have been middleweight champion for a lot longer than he was. But the champions were, I believe it was Johnny Wilson, was openly ducking him until Greb had like well over 200 fights. And he'd already beaten all of those Hall of Famers. What makes Greb's story more remarkable is that during this reign, he was actually completely blind in one eye. And he dealt with like over 100 injuries as well. It's a freakish story. Going up to super middleweight, this is more of a modern one because it's more of a modern weight division. I'm going to cut to the chase, really. I think you could kind of give a few fighters a shout. You had the great Mikhail Kessler. Even Carl Froch cemented himself as a top super middleweight. James Toney. Roy Jones was phenomenal at the weight division, but none of those guys were there as long as the top two, or ruled it as long as the top two. You have Andre Ward, who, pound for pound, has the greatest wins at super middleweight, one of the most adaptable fighters of all time. Beat everyone, undefeated. Beat the likes of Carl Froch, Mikhail Kessler, Arthur Abraham at the weight. Obviously, he scored victories over Chad Dawson and Kovalev as he moved up to light heavyweight. But for me, I'm going to go with Joe Calzaghe, who not only has a lot of his top wins at super middleweight, but also has the longevity. He ruled the division for a decade and had up to 20 title defences. Beat a prime undefeated Mikhail Kessler. Beat Chris Eubank. All of those title defences as well. I just think, for me, I would put him slightly above Ward. But this one is so tough. It's like, what do you go for? Do you go for Ward's slightly more eye-catching victories or Calzaghe's eye-catching victories and his longevity? Personally, I think Calzaghe was one of the most phenomenal fighters we've ever produced in Britain, and I'm going to put him as my greatest super middleweight of all time. Now, going on to light heavyweight, there's a few you can choose. I think Roy Jones was absolutely exceptional at super middleweight, really. He was good at light heavyweight as well. He also was on the slide during his light heavyweight days later on. But one of the best talents at light heavyweight, no doubt. You have the man who ruled the division for 10 years, Archie Moore, who was beat a who's who of killers. But from 38 to 48, I might just add as well, exceptionally. Just one of the craziest stories ever. But for me, the greatest light heavyweight is a man who was never actually light heavyweight champion. And it's the legendary Ezard Charles. Now, Ezard Charles was such a good fighter, one of the greatest of all time. To put into context, when he was young, getting chucked in at middleweight, he knew he wouldn't get a title shot, but he still fought the champions. Teddy Yaros, Anton Christoforidis, I don't know how you say his name, but he was the middleweight champion at the time. And one of the most avoided fighters in history in Charlie Burley, and beat them all. Scored a draw against the Hall of Famer Ken Overlin, but then moved up to light heavyweight, which is where he really stamped his authority. He beat Joey Maxim, the light heavyweight champion, that defeated the great Sugar Ray Robinson 5 times. Defeated Archie Moore 4 times. Defeated Hall of Famers in Jimmy Bivins, Lloyd Marshall. His resume is just off the charts. He ruled that division, and although he didn't win the title, he beat everyone around there was to beat. He then moved up to heavyweight, and in a 4-fight saga with Jersey Joe Walcott, beat him twice, defending the heavyweight title, and beat the great Joe Louis, and was on the verge of stopping the great Rocky Marciano. But at light heavyweight, he was just phenomenal, and he's the greatest light heavyweight of all time, in my opinion. Moving on to cruiserweight, again, another modern division. I'm going to give Alexander Usyk a shout out, the most recent undisputed cruiserweight champion. His run in the World Boxing Super Series was pretty phenomenal. Marco Huck, Murat Gassiev, which was a really tough victory, which I didn't actually expect him to win that one. I thought he might, but when the tournament started, I put Gassiev as the winner. You have to win against Bradis, the win against Tony Bellew. Just cleared out a really competitive division and done it in all of his opponents' backyards. But for me, I have to go with Evander Holyfield, who defeated the likes of Hall of Famers in Carlos De Leon. And just those amazing fights against Dwight Muhammad Qawi. I don't think there has been a better fighter at cruiserweight than Holyfield. And if I was going to put the two together, because their achievements are quite similar, although I do think Holyfield's level of opposition at the division is slightly better, I would pick Holyfield in that fight. And then he would obviously move up and have all of those legendary heavyweight fights. But I believe he was 18-0 by the time he cleared out the cruiserweight division. and just phenomenal. I'm going to have him as my greatest cruiserweight of all time. Moving up to the final one, heavyweights. There are two. My honourable mention, I'm going to just get cut straight to the chase. It's the longest reigning heavyweight champion of all time, Joe Louis. Joe Louis dominated this division in unprecedented fashion. Champion for 11 and a half years. 27 world title fights. 25 consecutive title defences. I believe, off the top of my head, in his prime when he retired, before he had to make the return due to financial issues, he had lost just to one man in 58 or 59 fights in Max Schmeling. Avenged that defeat in the first round. He'd knocked out around 7 Hall of Famers up to this point. Joe Louis was like the most perfect boxer you'll ever find. But my greatest heavyweight of all time has got to be Muhammad Ali, who was just the biggest icon in the sport, but also one of the greatest fighters of all time, one of the greatest boxers, has one of the greatest resumes of all time. It's becoming a little bit, what would the word be, disrespected in recent years by those that don't quite know the level of heavyweights in the 70s. Muhammad Ali beat the likes of Floyd Patterson, Sonny Liston, Archie Moore, Joe Frazier, George Foreman, Ernie Shavers, Ron Lyle. It's an absolute joke, and they're just the top names. All of those other names, George Savallo, Henry Cooper. Ali just had it all. His performance against Cleveland Williams, the 3-round demolition just before he was banned, is, in my opinion, the greatest boxing performance of all time. He's doing the shuffle. He's revolutionised the game with his movement. You did have fighters in the earlier days, like the likes of Gene Tunney, that would move, but no one moved like Ali. There's still not a heavyweight to this day that was as fast as Ali. Just a beautiful fighter. And then he come back after the ban. Obviously lost those reflexes a bit. And then like the brutal trilogy, even against Ken Norton. He showed his heart, his legendary chin, that toughness, just to dig through those hard fights. There's never been a heavyweight like Muhammad Ali. He reclaimed the world title multiple times. Unfortunately stuck on for too long, but was never knocked out because of the size of the heart of the man. The most brutal fights against Joe Frazier, the biggest upsets against Sonny Liston and George Foreman, and in my opinion, the greatest heavyweight of all time. So, there we go. I dug through that. That was quite a big task to get through, but those are my greatest in each weight division. Let me know what you think, and let me know if you agree. The beauty of these things is my opinion is not necessarily correct. It is my opinion. If you disagree, let me know. Hopefully, it just gave you some insight into some legendary fighters in the weight divisions, because that's what it was intended to do. I could even change my mind on these. It's not set in stone. I make these videos basically just to educate people on some of the older fighters and some of the most legendary fighters of all time. But all of these guys in here have a claim to being the greatest their division's ever seen. And in my opinion, these are the greatest in each division.